All right, and if you're just joining us, we're just pausing momentarily for folks to enter the webinar. We'll get started in just a moment. If you're already here, welcome. All right, let's go ahead and begin. I'm Julia with Politics in Prose. We're live with author Andrew Roberts and Michael F. Bishop discussing The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from us at Politics in Prose. If you have a question during this discussion, put those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll move to questions in the last portion of the hour, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time to get to all of them. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for the event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. We do want to thank all of you out there for joining us this afternoon. We're very grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. And now to this great new book. The Last King of America, George III, has been ridiculed as a complete disaster who frittered away the colonies and went mad in his old age. The truth is much more nuanced and fascinating, and will completely change the way readers and historians view his reign and legacy. Andrew Roberts is an award-winning and best-selling author of numerous titles, which we hope you'll find on our shelves. He is the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, chair of the judges of the Gilder Lehrman Military History Prize, and a visiting professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. Roberts will be joined in conversation this afternoon by Michael F. Bishop, a political and nonprofit professional, historian, and freelance writer. Recently, he served as a consultant in the office of the chairman at the National Endowment of Humanities and has previously worked as director of the National Churchill Library and Center of George Washington University, and as executive director of the International Churchill Society. On behalf of Politics in Prose, please join me in welcoming Andrew Roberts and Michael F. Bishop. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you very much, Julia. And Andrew, welcome to the colonies.
Thank you very much, and welcome to my bedroom, Michael.
Oh, thank you.
Admittedly, my bedroom in the Metropolitan Club in DC, but nonetheless. And also, thank you so much to Politics in Prose that has been around for a generation and is such a wonderful bookshop. I really appreciate having the opportunity to come on this.
It is indeed. Now, we got late-breaking word that this brilliant new biography has already won a rather important award. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, the General Society of Colonial Wars has given it its Distinguished Book Award yesterday. So I'm completely delighted by that, as you can imagine. Thank you.
Congratulations. What drew you to this subject in the first place? And really, how did George III come to be so misunderstood? Is it all the fault of Lin-Manuel Miranda?
I think that the thing that drew me really was the fact that I'd already written books about Napoleon and Waterloo and various moments in the history of the late 18th century, early 19th century, and so he was a fairly sort of well-established figure as far as I was concerned. And one thing that I was very conscious of was this concept about him being misunderstood, not just in your country, which is perfectly understandable, owing to the fact that you did overthrow him, but also in Britain as well, where 200 years of Whig historians thought of him and described him as a tyrant in much the same way that Thomas Jefferson did in the Declaration of Independence. And it struck me that when one looks at tyranny in the late 18th century, and there was a lot of it, especially in Russia with Catherine the Great, and in Prussia and Austria and so on, look at what French were doing in Corsica, what the Spanish did in New Orleans, that actually George III was in no way a tyrant in the 18th century sense of the phrase of being a cruel despot.
Mm. And you're very well known for doing prodigious research, but in this case, for this book, what new sources were recently unearthed that gave you new material with which to work?
Oh, I was so incredibly lucky. I'd love to pretend that it was archival genius, Michael, but it wasn't. It was pure serendipity that meant that whilst I actually started this book, Her Majesty the Queen made available no fewer than 200,000 pages from the Royal Archives of the Georgian Papers programme, which is this wonderful programme that King's College London and the Royal Archives put together. And about 100,000 of those pages were of George III's letters and archives and papers, correspondence, and so on. So the place is the sheer sort of avalanche of new material is quite breathtaking, and it does throw light on somebody who, as you say, up until now has been considered to be a very a sort of mad King George, sort of almost an evil figure, but in fact was, as is quite clear from this great cornucopia of new information, was a charming, intelligent, well-read, well-educated, and good-natured person.
Mm. Well, let's talk about the man himself. Where exactly was he born, and what was his family life like as he grew up?
Well, he was born very unusually for a king of England in England. He was born in London. He was the first person for over 150 years to be born and educated in England. And so that's and he made something of that. When he became king, he actually gave a speech to the opening of Parliament in which he said, "Born and bred in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." And he meant Britain as in Briton. He was proud to be British, and he didn't speak German as a first language. He didn't speak English with a German accent, like all his Hanoverian predecessors had. So that was a good thing. Unfortunately, his family life, his upbringing, his youth was very happy up until the age of 12. He was beloved by his parents, Princess Augusta and Frederick, Prince of Wales. And then when he was 12 years old, his father died very suddenly of an aneurysm. And this was a disaster because his grandfather, King George II, despised and disliked him, and in fact left his father's corpse to decompose in the room above George III's bedroom when the poor old 12-year-old was mourning his father. His father's putrefying corpse was left to decompose in the room above before finally George II was able to get round to think about burying it. And so you really have this extraordinary family of dysfunctional intergenerational loathing that goes on and on throughout almost all of them, apart from George III himself, who loved his father and his father loved him.
So his father dies, and George III comes to the throne at a fairly young age in 1760. What does the world look like? What is the situation he confronts as monarch in 1760?
Well, he comes to the throne age 22 in a world war. It's very often by historians called the First World War, because it's fought on many continents, right the way through to the Far East, of course, but also in America, where it in fact starts. You call it the French and Indian War, we call it the 7 Years' War, and it was pretty global. So with lots of fighting, of course, in Europe as well. So the country that he inherits, as it were, is one that is fighting on all fronts and pretty successfully. That's the good news, is that by the victory of 1763, the Treaty of Paris, Britain is established as unquestionably the most powerful empire in the world, or that the world had ever seen since Rome.
And then there are some troubles with the American colonies. Your book, in addition to being a really revelatory biography of George III, is in some ways kind of a revisionist history of the American Revolution, looking at it from another point of view, from another angle. And it's fair to say that you subject the Declaration of Independence to one of the more critical readings it's received in a long time. And you found that a number of its clauses don't really stand up to scrutiny. Talk about that.
Well, I think it was very important that one recognizes that America was ripe for independence by the 1760s, 1770s. You know, it was a country of 2.5 million people. It had a burgeoning economy. It had as many bookshops in Philadelphia as there were anywhere in the empire, apart from London. It was ready also because, of course, the Treaty of Paris that I mentioned earlier meant that there was no outside strategic threat from France in the North American continent. So it was perfectly understandable if the founding fathers, using a wartime propaganda document, this extraordinary Declaration of Independence, a beautifully written, sublime piece of Shakespearean language, which for the first third of it makes you proud to be human. Then in the second part of it, the last 2/3, it comes up with 28 clauses attacking George III, only 2 of which he was guilty of. And the key thing is that it had to do that because the founding fathers were, again, entirely understandably, clothing themselves in the mantle of the great revolutionaries of 1642 against Charles I and 1688 against James II. And so, of course, they needed to make George III into a kind of Stuart absolutist. But he wasn't anything like that. He was actually a Hanoverian. He didn't believe in the divine right of kings. He was a constitutional monarch. The only reason that he was on the throne was because his family were Protestants who didn't have that kind of strain of absolutism to them whatsoever.
Mm. So you mentioned the fact that George III was no tyrant, was a constitutional monarch. His reign seems to be in some ways a very transitional one, where his ministers seem really to be making policy and carrying out policy, but at the same time, he's still appointing and dismissing governments. Was he the last king to do that?
Not really, no. His granddaughter, Queen Victoria, also in the bedchamber crisis in 1839, dismissed the government, which had a majority in the House of Commons. George III admired, revered the British Constitution, and understandably so, because it gave him enormous powers. Although not, I notice in the Harvard Law Review of last April, powers that are greater than your present American president has. The imperial presidency actually is more powerful than George III, according to the Harvard Law Review. But the key thing, it strikes me, is that of those 28 charges that we talked about earlier, the 2 charges, the 17th, which is about taxation, and the 22nd, which is about George III's and indeed Parliament's right to overturn American legislation, domestic legislation, were in and of themselves justifications for the American Revolution. Those were enough to have the American Revolution. The other 26 charges were pretty much sort of lawyers' padding, frankly. There's an awful lot of ex post facto rationalization. There's a lot of things that he's accused of, which every monarch was guilty of, going back to the foundation of the colonies under Elizabeth I. So, James I. So, all in all, I think that one can see that Thomas Jefferson was padding his brief.
In addition to being a constitutional monarch and a political leader in many ways, your book points out that George III was also a patron of the arts and the sciences and farming. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, Thomas Paine, the great pamphleteer, who was so eloquent in Common Sense, his great pamphlet of 1776, which was a long attack on George III, called him at one point a royal brute. Sorry, the royal brute of Britain, he called him. This is the man who created the Royal Academy, who bought half of the paintings, had a wonderful artistic sense, and bought half of the paintings in the Royal Collection, which is today is the largest private art collection in the world, whose collection of books is his library of 80,000 books forms the nucleus of the British Library today. He built up the largest collection in the world of scientific instruments, which you can see today in the Science Museum in London. He promoted the great architects of the neoclassical Georgian architecture revolution, the figures like James Wyatt and Robert Adam and William Chambers. He was the planet Uranus was named after him because of his interest in astronomy and the fact that he paid for the largest telescope in the world. He was into music, played 4 instruments. He Handel and Haydn and Mozart all played for him, and he went out of his way to patronize each of them. So, the idea that he was a brute, whereas in fact he was one of the most cultured of all of our monarchs, is an appalling libel on a otherwise tremendously, as I say, good-natured person.
One thing that he didn't seem interested in doing much of was traveling. He never saw, he never visited Scotland. He never saw his Irish dominion, and certainly didn't make it across the ocean. Can you tell us about that and why he might have wanted to stick close to home?
No, and also he was Elector of Hanover, of course, and he never visited Hanover either. It is a conundrum. He was willing to buy 40,000 maps. He built up this extraordinary collection of topographical maps of America and those places that you mentioned as well, of which he was king. And yet he never actually himself went west of Plymouth or north of Worcester, which is extraordinary, considering that he had obviously a very sort of questing intellectual brain, but not one that felt that he needed to actually himself go to any of the places. He spent most of his life in the home counties, and an awful lot of it really at Windsor and London. It's one of the strange things, many strange features of him.
Yeah. Sadly for him and for his country, he eventually descended into madness. Can you tell us about how that first manifested itself, and also, frankly, about the fact that you've helped to correct the record about what caused it?
Yes, well, thank you for that, Michael. I appreciate that. And for 60 years, people have thought that George III suffered from porphyria, this disease, this physiological disease. But now that whole theory has been blown to smithereens, frankly. You can read about how that happened in my appendix. It's a sort of 4-page appendix at the back of the book. But basically what happened was a mother and son team, medical team, gave completely misleading symptoms to the doctors of the day back in the late 1960s, who came up with this theory of porphyria. I'm afraid that quite a lot of it depends on, it's all about the color of the king's urine and feces. It's not terribly delectable stuff, but nonetheless, it's clear, in fact, now from all of the medical views that, and I really did go widely into both the experts on porphyria, but also the top people in the Royal Society of Medicine and the Royal Society of Psychiatry, who accept now that it was the type 1, affective type 1 of bipolar disorder. George III was a manic depressive. He was not suffering from porphyria. And I think now that we are able to finally destigmatize mental illness in our generation, we're able to see that all of those historians, the Whig historians for the last 200 years, who effectively blamed George III for his own illness and treating it as a sort of moral weakness of his. I think we can get rid of all of that kind of thing and appreciate it for the terrible tragedy that it genuinely was.
Mm. So it wasn't just Lin-Manuel Miranda. I mean, it's the Whig historians who, for generations, helped create this portrait of George III that you're trying to correct in this book.
That's right, and it went up extraordinarily. It went up until the 1950s. Sir Lewis Namier, for example, said that the reason that the king went mad was because he was forced to make love so often to his hideous wife. Yeah. And can you imagine that kind of thing passing for genuine and serious history only 50 years ago? Completely ridiculous, and not least because she wasn't hideous either. Queen Charlotte was a rather wonderful woman, in fact, and they had 15 children together. And so to make these kind of remarks, I think shows how little how heavily stigmatized mental health was still in the 1950s.
Mm. Actually, that was going to be my next question. I thought your portrait of the royal marriage, and we're accustomed nowadays to thinking of royal marriages as often being dysfunctional or seriously dysfunctional, but it's a very moving portrait of a long and loving marriage. Maybe that helps explain why he didn't like to travel. And I wonder if you could tell us more about that. And also, and this really packed an emotional wallop, what it was like towards the end when his madness got to the point where their marriage simply couldn't survive under the strain.
Yes, well, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was a charming, intelligent, music-loving, philanthropic, demure, and queen and a wonderful mother. But unfortunately, after and actually the story of their love affair is quite extraordinary as well, because they actually only they got married only 6 hours after they met for the first time. It was obviously a strategic and political arranged diplomatic marriage in the way that royal marriages were in the mid 18th century, but nonetheless they fell in love with one another afterwards. And George III was the only one of the Hanoverian kings who was faithful to his wife and loved her. They had this very uxorious marriage until the tragedy of this terrible illness, this manic depression, took over in 1804 and meant they couldn't share a room together any longer. So essentially, they separated, and that was the end of a 44-year-old marriage, and a very happy one up until that point.
Your book is more than just a biography of a single monarch, but it's really a portrait of an age, and it was an age that included or that featured a great deal of political genius in the American colonies, but also in Britain itself. You had figures like Pitt the Younger, who became prime minister at age only 24. You had, I think, our mutual hero, Edmund Burke. You had remarkable figures, some of whom were strong supporters of George III, some passionate opponents. Could you tell us about that dimension of your book and some of these great figures of the age?
Yes, he was very unfortunate in a sense that of the 14 people he appointed as prime minister in his long reign, he was the most, still is today, the longest reigning king of England, nearly 60 years. Unfortunately, he only actually had 2 brilliant prime ministers. The first, as you mentioned, was William Pitt the Younger, and the other one was his father, William Pitt the Elder. And unfortunately, William Pitt the Elder was so appallingly destroyed almost by his gout that had sent him mad, essentially. And It was really a very, very sad demise. But for 2 years, he stayed on as prime minister, even though he didn't have any audiences with the king and hardly ever visited the House of Lords and Parliament. So it was, and this was a very seriously dangerous moment as well. It was between 1766 and 68, which of course was immediately after the repeal of the Stamp Act. So you have this vitally important moment where there's just nobody in charge. Otherwise, he also was very unlucky in that some of the other people he appointed, including very sort of jolly and good-natured people like Lord North, turned out to be useless wartime prime ministers. And his great friend and tutor, the Earl of Bute, who he appointed as prime minister, was simply not up to the role either. So overall, although you did have people who undoubtedly had genius, and you mentioned Edmund Burke, our hero, and you could so easily have mentioned several others, only two of them ever became prime minister.
Mm.
I'm going to try and turn on the light. See if that's any better. There we are. Yes, that's a bit nicer.
Great. You mentioned Lord North. Who bears the principal blame for the loss of the American colonies? Is it George III or is it Lord North as prime minister?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily either of them. It certainly isn't George III. He was a constitutional monarch who followed the advice of his government and his cabinet. When one looks at Lord North, who was, as I say, a useless wartime premier, however good he was in peacetime, and also several of the other ministers who were squabbling amongst themselves constantly, who were not strategists to any great degree. The one who was a strategist, Lord George Germain, who came up with the Germain Plan, which was to send one army up the Hudson River from New York, just as another one was coming down from Canada to try and meet at Albany and split off the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies. That all collapsed when the generals, in particular in this case, General Sir William Howe, who was the one who was coming up from New York, veered off eastwards to capture the enemy capital of Philadelphia, instead of meeting up with General Burgoyne, who subsequently gets captured at Saratoga in October 1777. So you have this problem really where our generals who all hated each other, admirals who all hated the generals and vice versa, apart from the Howe brothers, who unfortunately the elder one of which was incompetent, really did let down the king. And he wasn't helped either by the fact that the War Office and the Admiralty were daggers drawn, that the First Lord of the Admiralty hated Lord George Germain, and so on. You know, it really was an absolute dog's breakfast, frankly. And this was in a war that had to be fought at a distance of 3,000 plus miles, where 1/3 of a ton of supplies per soldier had to be shipped over to America. So logistically, it was also an incredibly difficult war to win. And although the British won more battles, that doesn't really matter in a war. You have to win the final one. And the sheer sublime leadership of George Washington, and especially after Saratoga, when the French get involved in their declaration of war against Britain in February 1778, and then the Spanish in 1779 and the Dutch in 1780, turn this colonial struggle into another global war, which Britain is completely outclassed and outgunned at.
Mm. You have painted a really remarkable portrait of a kind and a decent and enlightened constitutional monarch. But like every other leader, like every other person who ever lived, he had his weaknesses and failings. How would you describe his weaknesses?
Well, he was immensely self-righteous. He did think that he was right about everything, which is extraordinary considering that he was king at a time when Britain suffered its greatest strategic catastrophe between the loss of the Angevin lands in the 15th century and the fall of France in 1940. Somehow he didn't find any of that his fault at all. As I say, I don't think it was hugely, but nonetheless, he was very swift to point the finger at everybody else except for himself. He didn't have much of a sense of humor. The jokes in this book are very much the jokes of the great wits of the day. It was in many ways the golden age of political repartee. And so there are some very funny lines in it, but they don't come from George III, who I'm afraid his humor was what one might call Hanoverian. And so, but I think compared to the positive aspects of his nature, the people who knew him best loved him most, and I think that's always a very positive thing to say. And another thing that I came across in this and discovered really in this great cornucopia of new information was that when he was Prince of Wales, he was actually opposed to slavery. He thought that the arguments for slavery were worthy of being held up to execration, as he said. He thought they were ludicrous. He never owned a slave, never bought or sold a slave, never invested in any of the companies that did that. He signed the legislation that ended the slave trade. And so, to hold him in sort of moral, essentially what historians have done for 200 years is to say that he's sort of morally worse than the founding fathers. 41 out of the 56 of the signatures of Declaration of Independence did own slaves at some stage in their lives. I think is ludicrous now. I think we've got to have another look at him.
In 1801, under Prime Minister William Pitt, the Younger, Ireland became officially part of the United Kingdom with the Act of Union. And Pitt conceived this as a way to pacify Ireland, to make it to make the relationship between Britain and Ireland better, more highly functioning. But he had it in the back of his mind that part of that would have to involve Catholic emancipation, the ability of Catholics to vote and to be elected to Parliament. And he ran up against the opposition of George III. And as a result, after many years in office, Pitt resigned. Can you talk about that and explain why George III was so passionately opposed to Catholic emancipation and what the consequences were?
Yes, he was George III was a very pious Anglican. He was a true believer in the 39 Articles. He was somebody who knew that his entire dynasty were only there because they were Protestants. George I, the leader, the first man of his dynasty to be King of England, was 51st in line to the throne. It was only because he was Protestant that he became king. And so he took his coronation oath, George III took his coronation oath extremely seriously, which was to protect and defend the Church of England as by law established. And he understood that Catholic emancipation obviously was going to completely undermine that. He'd also seen back in 1780, he was a very brave man, George III personally, and in the Gordon riots, which killed about 400 people and destroyed more property than anything between the Great Fire of London and the London Blitz of 1940. He recognized that the power of a Protestant backlash was a terrifying thing to behold. And he didn't understand why William Pitt the Younger just suddenly came out with Catholic emancipation rather than either attempting to persuade him or anybody else of it. He didn't have the support of his cabinet. He didn't have the support of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And as I say, the king was a constitutional monarch, and he didn't believe that you could just overrule and override these extremely important parts of the constitution in order to do something that we recognize today as being immensely progressive and the right thing to have done, but which he reckoned, understandably, when it comes to the sheer numbers in the voters in Britain at that stage, would severely unbalance the constitution. And so it strikes me that, in fact, Pitt the Younger shouldn't have made these kind of sotto voce promises to the Catholics of Ireland. He should have either come out and publicly said that Catholic emancipation was the inevitable result, or he shouldn't have. But after the 1798 Irish Rebellion, they very much wanted to bring Ireland into the United Kingdom.
Before we turn to our audience questions, I just wanted to ask you what you thought of various portrayals of George III on television and on film. John Adams on HBO, the miniseries about the founding father, has a couple of scenes about or featuring George III. Of course, The Madness of King George was an immensely popular film that repeated the porphyria misdiagnosis to which you referred earlier. And of course, Hamilton. What do you think of these portrayals?
Well, and you haven't mentioned Bridgerton either, of course, in which Queen Charlotte.
Funnily enough, I missed that one. Yeah.
Queen Charlotte is portrayed. Actually, I've written there's a big interview of me about that in the New York Post yesterday, in fact, for anybody who's interested in the Bridgerton aspect of things. Well, I think Lin-Manuel Miranda, of course, it was just an absolute showstopper, wasn't it? Every time George III came on the stage, you couldn't help stop but sort of, tap your foot. Historically, though, completely and utterly wrong. The Madness of King George, which was originally a play by Alan Bennett and then Nicholas Heitner turned into a movie, I'm afraid also was based on him having porphyria, which simply was not the case. And what was the third one you mentioned?
John Adams on HBO.
Ah, yes. Well, that was an awful lot better. And actually, funny enough, that's a quite moving scene, because in June 1785, when John Adams became American ambassador to Britain, he had this important audience, with the king, and it was only 2 years after America had been fully independent, and the king reacted extremely positively and said that he recognized that he had been the first to oppose America becoming independent, but now that it had become independent, he wanted to be the first to welcome the Americans as an independent country, which is a big thing, really, for him to say. And then 15 years afterwards, he said of George Washington that he was the greatest character of the age. So, in fact, I think George III should be congratulated from at least for being able to recognise the new realities.
Well, let us turn to audience questions. We have a question here about George III's relationship with his children, especially as adults, and what this might indicate about his character. I've read a theory that his inability to let go of control of his family was in some way akin to his reluctance to relinquish the colonies.
Well, I don't go along with that kind of psychodrama side of things at all. No, the problem with not letting go was that he had 15 children, and most of them grew up into, the vast majority, all but two, became adults. And who do you marry them to? Because they have to marry, by law, they have to marry Protestant princes or princesses. And there are a few in Germany and some in Scandinavia, but there just simply weren't enough. And so these poor girls, as it turned out, the princesses, they stayed at Windsor, which they called the nunnery, and they had affairs with the tall, dark, handsome war hero equerries of the king, and one of them actually had a child by one of them. And to all intents and purposes, they had sort of illegitimate marriages, and all of these marriages were illegitimate anyway because of the 1772 Royal Marriages Act, which was brought in to stop the brothers and uncles and children of the king marrying anybody who he didn't give permission for them to marry. But we really cannot impose 21st century marital mores and relationship mores on the late 18th century royal family, because a marriage had profound strategic and political implications in those days, as they had done throughout history up until that point. And so it wasn't him trying to be a monster or a beast. It was simply the way that it was a sort of institutionalized, systematic problem.
We have another question here from an anonymous attendee. How was the British Empire so successful in maintaining its colonies worldwide during the height of its rule? It's striking that monarchies wielded so much power over places they rarely visited.
Well, they learned the lesson of it's a very good question. They learned the lesson of the American War of Independence, frankly, and they devolved an awful lot more power to the colonies. So Canada, of course, had almost entirely become self-governing by the 1830s. Australia was by 1900. It was a question of setting up what today is the Commonwealth, essentially, whereby the individual countries govern themselves and therefore were less likely to want to declare unilateral independence. It was a question of sort of learning from his mistakes.
James Wilson asks, George III had a remarkable map room and collection, did he not? Could you speak about that?
Yes, he did. He had one of the largest topographical collections in the world. It covers 40,000 maps. You can see it at the British Museum. It's extraordinarily well curated there, as you can imagine. A lot of the maps were of America. He was very interested in America. This is another myth about him, the idea that he was sort of distant, and he was physically distant, obviously, but he wasn't emotionally distant from America. He bought lots of books on America. He interviewed Native American chiefs whenever they came over. He talked to lieutenant governors and the governors of the American provinces when they were in Britain. So, he did have an active interest in the United States, but also throughout his empire. And that's why this map collection is quite so impressive.
William Dunlap would like to know more about Lord North and his role in the loss of the American colonies.
Yes, he was a very, this is the interesting thing about North, he was a very good domestic prime minister. He was funny and engaged and suffered fools gladly and all of those things you have to do as prime minister, getting on with everybody. And then came the war, and he was totally uninterested in anything martial. He didn't want to learn about strategy and tactics and what was necessary. He didn't like the idea of taxing the British people so to create enough money to fight this war. He didn't like the amount of recruitment that was necessary. We only had 35,000 troops in America. At the very top, we had 50,000, which is nothing like enough to hold down a country of the expanse of what was to become the United States. So he just simply wasn't the man for the job. He needed to hire and fire people, which he didn't like doing. He liked to hang on to people, and he asked to resign. And this is another major criticism that I make in the book of George III. He asked to resign on some 20 occasions. And George III wouldn't let him because he couldn't see anybody who'd be any better. And yet he should have taken the risk and found anybody, frankly, because anybody would have been better than Lord North.
Hmm. Another attendee asks, do you think part of the disconnect between the grievances listed in the Declaration and George III's actual wrongdoings is due to the distance between England and the colonies?
Yes, I think that's probably a fair summation, but not primarily, because primarily this is a wartime propaganda document that is needs to essentially make George III out into a villain and a tyrant, and a tyrant, as the Declaration of Independence says, not just any old tyrant, but a tyrant who does not deserve to rule over a free people. And to do that, you needed to have a lot of accusations, 28, as I mentioned. And even though the vast majority of them, almost all of them, just simply don't hold water, because they're either criticisms of him for doing things that happened after the revolt had already broken out, or they are things that had been in American law since the reign of Elizabeth I or Oliver Cromwell, you name it. So, and then there are some that are completely invented, by the way. I mean, he's accused of taking people abroad across the oceans for trial, and not a single person during the reign of George III was taken across the oceans for trial. You can't name one. So, you know, it was a classic example of a wartime propaganda document, and that's perfectly understandable. You're fighting a war, and those aren't things that just are sort of lost in the mid-Atlantic translation. They are a definite and straightforward. It's all summed up, by the way, in chapter 13 of my book. Attempt to clothe the founding fathers in the mantle of earlier revolutions.
Another attendee asks about some of your favorite trivia about George III. Anything odd or quirky about him and his personality?
Well, actually, funny enough, yes, there are several things. He had this expression, what, that he would end sentences with, which you do get. That is one of the things that Alan Bennett does get right in his madness of George III. He also used to go off, because nobody knew what he looked like, you know, in those days, unless you'd actually physically seen the king, because they didn't have banknotes or stamps or anything else like that, let alone television. You didn't really know what he looked like, because he didn't look terribly much like the head on the coins that you saw. There weren't that many portraits and prints of him. So actually, he would dress as a normal English country gentleman, which is something that he did. He was a man very much of sort of frugal tastes and prudent financial interests. So he didn't dress up like the Bourbons at Versailles. And actually, when the French Revolution broke out, that probably was one of the sort of more intelligent things, the way in which he hadn't gone in for all of that kind of pomp and circumstance. And so he'd go out into the fields and wander the streets and chat to farmers. He was very interested in farming. He was called Farmer George, in fact. It was his nickname. And he used to write articles about crop rotation and manure and things like that, which kings of England didn't tend to do. And he would stop and talk about the price of pigs to farmers in the street, and they would at no point recognise that it was the King of England until after the meeting was over, which I think is rather endearing of him, actually.
He sounds a bit Victorian sometimes for a Georgian, you know, with his parsimony.
That's a very good point, because actually I put down a lot of, I think one of his lasting legacies, in fact, is the modern monarchy. I think that it comes from George III much more, in fact, than from Queen Victoria, which everybody else, you know, puts it down to. When one looks at the things that he gave us, or at least gave the modern monarchy, he bought Buckingham Palace, he bought the Gold Stage coach, He set up the Trooping of the Colour, the Royal Walkabouts, the Royal Enclosure at Ascot. He was the first king to be buried at Windsor since Charles I, since when all of them have been buried there. His commitment to hard work and to duty, which one sees, of course, in her present Majesty. You know, these are things I think that can be put down to him rather than to his granddaughter, Queen Victoria.
Here's an interesting question from an attendee. Before you delved into the papers recently released by the Queen, did you suspect that George III had been misrepresented, or was this somewhat of a revelation?
Gosh, that is a good question. I can't remember now. It was 3 years ago since I started writing this book. I must have suspected it. Otherwise, I don't think I would have. I'd have, proposed the book. But
Right.
but I don't look back at book proposals. I think it's a very important thing that you use a book proposal, obviously, to get a publisher interested in the book, but you don't use it as a template for a book, because otherwise you're stuck in the trammels of preconceived ideas. You really must, as soon as you've signed a contract and got down to researching the book, you must forget about the book proposal and go wherever the evidence leads you.
Very good. Interesting. Another attendee says that in the 70s, Prince Charles championed George III on television. Was Prince Charles of any help with your research?
Oh, that's kind of, yes. Well, actually, he contributed a foreword to the last major biography, Cradle to the Grave biography of George III, which was published in 1972. And it's amazing to think that half a century has gone by since the last biography of him. And he contributed a very interesting foreword, actually, in which he posited the idea about what would have happened if George III had crossed the Atlantic and basically, stayed in America, lived in New York, or had at least met all of the key political figures in the 1760s, 1770s, and whether or not there's a sort of counterfactual that could have been made, whether or not things might have gone differently. It's a lovely thing to think about. I don't think so myself, but nonetheless, I do quote from that thing that Prince Charles wrote.
James Wilson asks, why do you think the British people still accept a monarchy almost 400 years, well, give or take, after we gained independence? 250 years anyway.
Because it works. Because it gives us a power above politicians. It means that if a politician goes too far, becomes megalomaniacal, is a sort of danger to the state, then they can be dismissed, and you don't have to put up with them for a mandated 4-year period. If a politician was to grow very old and not be in control any longer, he or she can be just got rid of and dismissed. And so there are ways in which the British Constitution has worked for us very well. It's seen us through the First World War and the Second World War very well. If we had a Richard Nixon, for example, he could be sacked overnight, and you just get somebody else in, and so long as they control the confidence of the House of Commons, then they get on with the job. And so it's a bit more flexible, I think, than some other systems. Of course, it's a bit of a lottery. All monarchy is a lottery because you don't know how good the next person's going to be. But overall, I think for the last 250 years, we've had a pretty good run. And of course, for the last 75 years, we've had a wonderful run with somebody who has the dignity of a head of state, equal, I think, to anybody in the world.
An attendee asks, what are some good contributions made by George III to America? Anything that we can still see in practice?
golly, well, as I say, he wasn't there for long enough, really, I think is one thing to point out. You revolted against him only 16 years into his reign, so I don't think he could be blamed for not having left very much of a legacy. And any part of his legacy was, of course, very comprehensively ripped up in 1776. They removed his name from various towns and streets. They pulled down his insignia and so on. So I think that he can be blamed for a lot of things, but a lack of legacy in America is probably not one of them.
Oh no, I'm not going to ask you that one. Let's see. I feel like part of the idealized America, asks an anonymous attendee, part of the idealized America is the notion that the founders and revolutionaries were more rugged and willing to do hard work, whereas a king figure was pampered and privileged. Is that a fair judgment?
Well, actually, your founding fathers were incredibly hardworking and multi-talented people. So many of them were real sort of giants of the age, and poor old George III coming up against that galaxy, that galère of talent was very unlucky for him in a sense. But he was incredibly hardworking himself. Oh gosh, I don't think you managed to build up this incredible collection of. I mean, I'm speaking as somebody who obviously has read thousands of pages of his correspondence. He was very hard at work every day, usually from about 6 o'clock in the morning through to 9 o'clock at night. He timed as well as dated all of his letters. And so we know from looking at hundreds and hundreds of them when he was working. And it was incredible. He was working pretty much throughout the day. I do go into this in my book, as you can imagine. And so the idea of these sort of pampered people is certainly not the case. And he certainly wasn't physically pampered. He would ride 40 miles a day. When he was out hunting, he would walk 15 miles a day on a pretty much a normal day. He was fit and healthy. As I say, he had 15 children that he was interested in bringing up. I don't think that that's the mark of someone who's lazy. He was a really very committed to the well-being of his people. He would go to the theatre and the opera constantly. He was an active monarch, and it was just completely tragic that he fell victim to this truly terrible psychological disorder, which cut off his chance of spending the last 10 years of his life happy. Unfortunately, they were spent. The last chapter of this book is a sad one. He was blind, he was deaf, he was senile, and he was mad. A terrible combination, and truly full of pathos.
One last question, a quick one that you may wish to dodge anyway. If King George was around today, whom would he summon to the palace to form a government? Keir Starmer or Boris Johnson?
Well, as I say, he was the consummate constitutional monarch. So he would summon the person who could command the majority of the House of Commons. And after the December 2019 general election, that is Boris Johnson with a majority of 83. So it would be Boris. How Boris and George III would get on is a very interesting and slightly moot point. I suspect that even though he was not a barrel of humour, as I have pointed out, I think that George III would have seen the attraction in Boris Johnson.
That's great. Well, Andrew, thank you. Congratulations on a superb book. I'll just remind all the viewers that the holidays are upon us, and this magnificent book would make a perfect gift bought from Politics and Prose. And I'll yield to Julia.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Julia. And it's been an absolute delight and hugely impressive, intellectually impressive body of questions as well, which is always such a pleasing thing for an author.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank the two of you so much on behalf of Politics in Prose. Our thanks author Andrew Roberts, Michael F. Bishop, and our audience out there again for these thoughtful and engaging questions. Your patronage and dedication enable us to bring you this incredible programming. Your screen to purchase the book directly from us at Politics in Prose, or just visit politics-prose.com. You can check out the rest of our events calendar there for everything else coming up. And from our shelves to yours, we hope you are out there staying safe, staying strong, and of course, staying well read. And we'll see you next time. Thanks again to you both.
Thank you.